Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is for you. Welcome everybody and happy Hoshana Rabbah, happy seventh day of Sukkot. A mystical day for many on the calendar and a wonderful day to talk about Torah and the end of the Torah, especially as we are also just 2 days out from Simchat Torah, when we read the final portion of the Torah and also go back and begin the first. So my name is Rachel Scheinerman. You're with My Jewish Learning this morning, and we are so delighted to see you all this morning. Please go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat. Tell us where you're from, because it's always very exciting to see the geographic diversity in these calls, and for me to see names of people that I have seen at other events and to also meet new people. It's really delightful. And I am so delighted to be joined for this session this morning by Rabbi Elliot Goldberg. Rabbi Goldberg, would you give everybody a wave?
Hi, everybody. Chag Sameach.
There he is. Rabbi Goldberg is an executive coach and consultant. He has more than 2 decades of experience in Jewish day schools and Ramah camps, and he is a regular contributor to My Jewish Learning's A Daily Dose of Talmud, which if you love daily Torah study, you should join us for that. And we are also joined this morning by Dr. Ethan Schwartz. Dr. Schwartz, why don't you unmute yourself and give a wave?
Hi, everyone.
There he is. Dr. Schwartz is an assistant professor of Hebrew Bible at Villanova, and his research focuses on prophetic literature, the Pentateuch, which is the academic word for the 5 books of Moses, the literature of the Quran, and the ancient Jewish context of the New Testament.
Qumran. I don't know anything about the
Quran. Oh,
Quran.
yes. That's what happens when I read instead of think.
That's a big difference. That's a big
difference.
difference.
That makes sense coming out of my mouth. Well, you're maybe
it's only maybe 1 letter off, I guess. But yeah, that's no one's ever claimed that I'm a Quran expert, but I
Qumran. So the Qumran, meaning the Dead Sea Scrolls, some of the earliest copies of the Hebrew Bible that we have. One of the most exciting archaeological finds of the 20th century, maybe in my view ever, but that might just illustrate my own narrow focus on Jewish things. All right, and we're about to get underway celebrating the book of Deuteronomy and the whole Torah. And I always invite you to share your thoughts in the comments, which I'll have a chance to look at in a few minutes. Please tell us what stood out to you from the book of Deuteronomy, or if you like, from the whole Torah. And please also feel free to share questions for our panelists. We are lucky to have a rabbi and a professor with us, so we can answer questions from a lot of perspectives. And before I turn it over to them, I thought I would just take a few minutes to frame the discussion by talking about the name of this final book of the Torah, Deuteronomy. In Hebrew, the name of this book is Devarim, which simply means words or things, and it comes from the first verse. That is how in Hebrew we refer to the books of the Torah. We pick out a keyword from the first verse. But Deuteronomy, which is our English name, reveals some more information about the book. It actually derives from Greek, and it is a combination of 2 words, deutero, meaning 2, and nomos, meaning law. So the term means something like second law. And this actually better reflects what the ancient rabbis of the Talmud called the book. They called this final book Mishneh Torah, which means something like repetition of the law or second teaching. And that's a phrase that actually comes from the book of Deuteronomy itself. In the middle of the book of Deuteronomy, in chapter 17, verse 18, we're told that when he, the king, meaning the king, it's rules for the king, we're in the middle of right there, is seated on the royal throne, he shall have a Mishneh Torah, a copy of this Torah, and we'll talk about what Torah means, written for him by the Levitical priests. Okay, so this sort of invites us, I think, to reflect for just a few minutes on the meaning of the word Torah, because we probably most of us come to this call with the idea that the Torah refers to the 5 books of Moses, which we read all year. But the Torah itself doesn't necessarily think that the word Torah means that. And exploring the meaning of the word Torah throughout the Torah actually tells us a lot about how the Torah was constructed and what Deuteronomy is all about. So I'm going to take 5 minutes of our time to do this before I hand this presentation over to our panelists. I brought a source sheet, which I'm now going to pop into the chat. Okay, so here it is. Oh, and thank you to Mara, who works tirelessly in the background to make everything seamless. She has popped it up onto a screen share. Can everybody see this source sheet? Looks like some of you have logged into it on your own machines as well. Wonderful. Okay, so the word Torah, incidentally, the root of this word is a little bit contested, and Dr. Schwartz, please jump in if you have anything to add here. The root we think is Yud Resh He, which seems to have meant something like to shoot an arrow. And of course, the word Torah is in a causative conjugation, which means you cause something to go straight. And so, of course, what makes you go straight? A teaching. And in fact, in the early books of the Torah, the word Torah seems to refer just to a single discrete teaching. So I brought you some examples from across those books. So in Genesis, the word only occurs once. This is God speaking to Abraham, saying, I will make your heirs as numerous as the stars of heaven, and I will assign to your heirs all these lands, so that all the nations of the earth shall bless themselves by your heirs, right? Famous passage. Inasmuch as Abraham obeyed me and kept my charge, my commandments, mitzvotai, my laws, chukotai, and my, here it's translated as teachings, toratai. And it's, torotai, and it's plural. My teachings are parallel to my mitzvahs and my laws, my mitzvot and my chukot. Okay, clearly doesn't mean the whole Torah, the 5 books of Moses, though of course the later rabbis interpret this to mean that Abraham kept the whole 5 books of Moses. But if you read it in context, that doesn't seem to be what it means. Similarly, in Exodus, right? The Lord says, come up to me and wait there, and I will give you the stone tablets and the teaching and the commandments which I have inscribed upon them, the Torah and the mitzvah. And this is usually translated in as a collective plural, but the words in the Hebrew are singular. And again, it's parallel to mitzvah, doesn't seem to mean something like a big long book, but rather a discrete teaching that is being handed down. And finally, here's an example from Leviticus. There are many more examples in the Torah. I just brought 3. This is the Torah, which here has been translated ritual of the sacrifice of well-being that one may offer to the Lord. Right? This is the Torah of the sacrifice. This is how you do this sacrifice, the teaching about how to do the sacrifice. Okay. I see a comment asking us to enlarge. So Mara, I'll leave that in your hands if it can be made any bigger. If not, Renee, you can put it up on your own machine or hold on to the link for later. Okay, so now let's shift over to Deuteronomy. And here I've brought a long passage. I'm going to make us read pretty much a whole chapter here in Deuteronomy 5, because I think it gets at what Deuteronomy itself thinks it's about. Okay, so Deuteronomy opens with Moses and the Israelites on the east bank of the Jordan River. They're close to entering the promised land, but of course we know, spoiler alert, Moses is not going to get to cross into the land. He's going to die at the end of the book. And it is Joshua, his successor, who is going to take them into the land. And while they are on the cusp of entering the promised land, Moses delivers speeches to the Israelites and the core of Deuteronomy, which is a whole package of laws, sometimes referred by scholars refer to this as the Deuteronomic Code. And here is the beginning of that legal material. Actually, this might be more in the speeches. Dr. Schwartz will give us the exact straight answer on that. But here in Deuteronomy 5, Moses summons all the Israelites, and he said to them, "Hear, O Israel, the laws and rules that I proclaim to you this day, study them and observe them faithfully." And now he's going to retrospect. "The Lord our God made a covenant with us at Horeb," which is what Deuteronomy calls Sinai. "Face to face, the Lord spoke to you on the mountain out of the fire, and I stood between the Lord and you at that time to convey the Lord's words to you, for you were afraid of the fire and did not go up the mountain." And then Moses repeats exactly what God said on the mountain. Those are the 10 commandments. I've interpreted them real quickly here. "I'm the Lord your God, no other gods before me. Don't swear falsely, keep the Shabbat, honor your father and mother, don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't bear false witness, and don't covet your neighbor's wife or any of their other stuff." Okay? And then Moses recounts. He says, "The Lord," this is the part I want us to focus on, "the Lord spoke those words and no more to your whole congregation at the mountain with a mighty voice out of the fire and the dense clouds, and God inscribed those words on the 2 tablets of stone and gave them to me. When you heard the voice out of the darkness, while the mountain was ablaze with fire, you came up to me, all your tribal heads and elders, and said, 'The Lord our God has just shown us a majestic presence. We have heard God's voice out of the fire. We have seen this day that humankind may live, though addressed by God,'" which is a surprise, that being directly spoken to by God, you can still live. And then they continue, "Let us not die then, for this fearsome fire will consume us. If we hear the voice of our Lord any longer, we will die. For what mortal ever entered the voice of the living God, what mortal ever heard the voice of the living God speak out of the fire as we did and lived? So you, Moses, you go closer, you hear God," the Lord our God says, "and then you tell us everything else that God tells you, and we will willingly do this." Right? So the conception in Deuteronomy is that the Israelites only made it through the 10 commandments, and then they were too afraid to stand in God's presence any longer, and they begged Moses to go up and receive the rest of the laws from God, while they hung back. And the idea, I believe, here in Deuteronomy is that now Moses, 40 years later, Moses is finally ready to tell them the rest of what was heard on Mount Sinai. Okay, so we'll just finish out this chapter. "The Lord heard the plea that you made to me, and the Lord said to me, I have heard the plea that this people made to you. They did well to speak thus. May they always be of such mind to revere me and follow my commandments, that it may go well with them and with their children forever. Go, say to them, return to your tents. But you, Moses, remain here with me. I will give you the whole instruction, the laws, the rules that you shall impart to them, for them to observe in the land that I am giving them to possess." Okay, and then we flip right over to Deuteronomy 16. And it begins, "This is the instruction. These are the rest of the laws and the rules that the Lord your God commanded me to impart you." I'm finally ready to tell them all to you, that you may observe them in the land that you're about to cross and occupy, because once you get into the land of Israel, this all goes into effect. "Obey and Israel willingly and faithfully, that it may go well with you, and that you may increase in the land that is flowing with the milk and honey, as the Lord, the God of your ancestors, spoke to you." And here's the beginning of the rest of the laws. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one," right? This is where the Shema comes in. It's the beginning of the rest of the laws. "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might," et cetera, et cetera. Okay, I'm going to leave it off there. So Deuteronomy understands itself to be a larger collection of laws that were revealed on Mount Sinai. And now what we're going to look at is a few cases in the book where it uses the word Torah, and see what that means. Okay, so let's start with Deuteronomy 17:18, which I brought which I mentioned earlier. Right, this is one of those laws handed down on Sinai. "When he, the king, is seated on his royal throne, he shall have a copy of this teaching, a Mishneh Torah, a copy of the teaching written for him on a scroll by Levitical priests." Okay, so now it seems like Torah is the whole set of laws, right? It's not just one, but it's the whole set that's written on the scroll. And Deuteronomy tells us the king is supposed to keep this at his hip pocket, as it were, so that he can consult it and rule justly. Okay. Let's look also at Deuteronomy 27, verse 2. As soon as you have crossed the Jordan into the land that the Lord your God is giving you, you shall set up large stones, coat them in plaster, and inscribe upon them all the words of this Torah. What is Deuteronomy talking about? I suspect that what it's talking about is the middle of Deuteronomy, all those laws that are in the middle of Deuteronomy, but we can discuss that. And Deuteronomy 31:9, we're getting toward the end of the book now. Moses wrote down this Torah, this teaching, and gave it to the priests, the sons of Levi, who carried the Ark of the Lord's covenant, and to all the elders of Israel. And then in the book of Joshua, which seems to be authored by the same school as the book of Deuteronomy and comes right after it in the Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible, we see that Joshua crosses the Jordan with the people, sets up some stones, and inscribes the Torah that Moses had written for the Israelites on those stones so that they can see it. So, a couple of meanings of Torah, right? In the earlier books of the Torah, it seems to mean just a discrete teaching. In the book of Deuteronomy, it seems to mean the set of laws that were handed down on Sinai, the full set of laws. And for us, of course, Torah means the 5 books of Moses as we have them now. So I don't want to take up any more of our time. That's my short introduction to the book of Deuteronomy. I want to hand the microphone over to our guests. But please share your questions and thoughts. I'll have a little time to peruse the comments now. And I want to hear some reflections. Dr. Schwartz, I think we'll start with you on this book. And then, no, we should start with Dr.
I think Rabbi Goldberg should start.
We should start with Rabbi Goldberg. Okay, Rabbi Goldberg, we'll hear some reflections from you. And then we will open it up for discussion.
All right. Dr. Schwartz is set up to rebut whatever I say. He'll give you that. That's fine. I have some disparate thoughts to share about the book of Deuteronomy that some connect to what Rachel started us off with, but really come from where I am today as we, on Hoshana Rabbah, as we get ready for Simchat Torah, where we're going to end our reading of the Torah and start again. And so my focus is, while we'll connect to the book as a whole, is a little more on the end of the book and our experience of it as we close and start again. So first, I just want to note that this week, it's Friday morning, and a usual week for my Jewish learning, this would be a session on Parshat Shavua, and we'd be slotted today to talk about Vizot Bracha, which we're going to read on Sunday on Simchat Torah. Right, Saturday, this Shabbat is also Shmini Atzeret. It has a different Torah reading. But I just want to note that the end of the book of Devarim, we never read by itself, like the last Parsha. Vizot Bracha doesn't go with the Shabbat. But the last Shabbat before the end of the cycle is Zinu, which we read before. And so the end of the Torah is always connected to the beginning of the Torah in our rituals, in our liturgical cycle, so that we read the end and we automatically start over at the beginning. And I think that's just, I love that moment that we don't let the Torah just finish. We finish and we go right back, like almost in the next breath, to the beginning. That it's a continuous cycle. It happens if you stay in synagogue long enough for the Haftorah after. We continue also according to the narrative trend, because we start the book of Joshua as the Haftorah on Sunday as well. But I like the sense that we're always restarting. And for me, it's that restart is a hopeful moment, because the end of the Torah is really hard for me personally, I would say. And Rachel, you said this before, like I was holding out hope. You gave the spoiler alert. We know that Moses isn't going to get into the land of Israel, and he's going to die on the east banks of the Jordan. And maybe it's because I'm a Cubs fan and I hold out hope till the last moment that, like, this is our year. If you're a baseball fan, It happened to the Cubs. It was like we almost made the playoffs, and I was sure we were going to get in until we didn't. Like I was paying very close attention in Shul and Yom Kippur. We have a forgiving God who sets aside our sins and forgives us so we can move on to the next year. And I believe to the last possible moment that God's going to forgive Moses, and Moses is going to he might turn things over to Joshua to lead the people, but he'll get to cross over the Jordan into the promised land. And, maybe he'll get some villa in the Galilee to retire in about his days. In nice, respectful retirement after the fruits of all of his labor the past, 40 years of the narrative. But so I'm not ready to give up on that dream until Sunday when we read it for sure. But as we built up to it in the Torah, and as this is going, really, Deuteronomy in some ways is Moses's book. Moses is the narrator of the book of Deuteronomy, different from, Moses is a character and a major speaker in the rest of the Torah from the perspective of the Torah itself. Right? Moses, it's his words in the book of Deuteronomy. And it makes this book that we're ending now, I think, different from the Torah's perspective from the rest of the Torah. I imagine Dr. Schwartz afterwards might talk about like modern perspective. Don't know for sure what you're presenting, but might reflect on some of our modern takes about how different of the source of the end of the Torah from the first four books. But from the Torah's perspective itself, this one is different because the book as a whole, Moses is the narrator, and it's more or less his last orations, his final speech. It's almost like he's getting an honorary doctorate and giving an address to the people or something at the end. He's speaking to the people. And that phrase that Rachel talked about, that this is somehow Mishneh Torah, a repetition of the Torah, a repeat of the Torah, coming back to it is actually what a lot of the book is. Besides Moses telling the people what they need to know to prepare as they enter the land, he's reviewing what happened before. And in some ways, I think of Deuteronomy from the perspective of the Torah it's in some ways it's the first telling of the Torah, because Moses is recounting what has happened, what it means, what it will mean into the future. And while it's not the reading of the Torah like we do, Moses is modeling the first retelling of the Torah in his own way in this last book. And in some way, this sense of the cycle that we keep continuing to tell this story again and again every year, Moses models for us in the last fifth of the Torah itself. And that leads to me to think about from how the rabbis think about the book and how they section it off a little bit from the other Torah. In Masechet Bava Batra in the Talmud, which about half a year it's going to be in the Daf Yomi cycle, maybe a little more. It's out there, it's coming. The rabbis talk about who are the people that wrote down the different books of the Bible. So they give traditional answers to that, but what I love is that the rabbis recognize that from their perspective, humans wrote down the different books. They say a couple things that's interesting about Deuteronomy. So first is they say Moses wrote his book, Sifro, his book, and the story about Bilam. Right in the middle of Bamidbar, which we talked about at the end of Bamidbar a little bit together. There's a story where Bilam, a foreign prophet, comes and speaks and ends up is meant to curse the Israelites and ends up praising them. And anyways, the rabbis in the Talmud here say Moses was the one who wrote down his book and the story of Bilam. And while a lot of the translations of that, and some of the commentators say, well, Moses wrote his book, that's the whole Torah. It strikes me that a close reading of that text is, if the rabbis are saying Moses wrote the Torah and the story of Bilam, the Bilam is in the Torah, so they can't mean the Torah as a whole. And there's a way that I think the rabbis are already differentiating between their read of Deuteronomy and the rest of the Torah, that somehow because it's Moses' speeches that make up the book, that somehow Moses' authorship of this part of the book is different, right? The divine human partnership about this book is different, than Moses might have wrote these speeches and told the story from before, whereas the first books might be different. And maybe in the rabbi's view, more direct from God. And this was Moses' telling in his own words, which leads me to what, especially because I lament this end of Moses at the end of Torah. While we do end saying Moses was the greatest prophet ever, and we've never seen anyone like him before, it is sad for me that he doesn't get the reward that everyone else gets to go into the land of Israel. But the last 8 verses of the Torah start with a passage where it says, right, Deuteronomy 34:5, the text says, Moses, the servant of God, died there. And the rabbis sort of ask about this. Who wrote these last 8 verses of the Torah? And there are 2 perspectives that they give about this. One is that, Moses is the scribe. Moses is the prophet who connected with God. It's Moses who was in charge of the process of writing down the Torah or this Torah or the different pieces of it. And he wrote it down till the end, including these end verses that describe his own end. And the other perspective the rabbis present in the Talmud is that Moses is the writer of the Torah up until the last verses. And the last mercy that God had for Moses was that God did not make Moses write down the verses that recorded his own end, and that Joshua is the person who recorded the last 8 verses of the Torah. As he was taking over, one of his first tasks was to be the person who recorded that final moment in the Torah. Moses staying east of the Jordan, Moses being brought up to the mountaintop to be with God, and and meeting his end and his death only in God's presence, in a sight that the Torah doesn't record and no one's supposed to know, perhaps because we don't want it to become a Moses shrine. He should just vanish from the stage. And I'm really struck by this, and will be, I'm sure, again Sunday as we read it on Simchat Torah, that there's a real sadness to the end of the Torah, that Moses, who has been the leader of the people for 40 years of the plot, but really since the beginning of Shemot, 4 of the 5 books of the Torah, serves and doesn't reap all the benefits that of what he worked so hard to do. And some read this as a tough life lesson about leadership and the importance of transition from Moses to Joshua, and that's important to know when to step down and to move off the stage. For me, it's this hard moment that I think Moses deserves more, which is why I hold out hope that this year God's going to forgive Moses for striking the rock and not talking to it and let him into Israel in the end. When I'm disappointed, which especially my teenagers point out to me that will happen on Sunday, what I love is, which is the comment I started with, immediately after we end the Torah, the world's created again. And just like we're starting the new year, more or less, right? This is the holiday season of Rosh Hashanah and the fall and the new holidays and new beginnings. I love that as soon as we read of Moses' death, we read of the creation of the world. And like a true Cubs fan, as we open Breshit, the first thing I turn to my wife and say in Shul every year is, this year, I believe Moses is going to get to go to Israel. God's going to forgive and it's going to turn out okay. So I only have to sit in this sadness of Moses' end for those few moments. Anyways, those are some of my thoughts about the end of the Torah and what we're going to experience over the weekend. There's a lot more to say about the book of Deuteronomy, but I'm going to, I see someone in the chat said Red Sox fans relate too. Yes, I appreciate that to my American League brothers and sisters. But I'm going to pause here, and I think I'm turning things over to Dr. Schwartz, unless, Rachel, you want to make a comment in transition.
I'll make a quick transitional just to follow up on some of that. Thank you. I'm struck that you say you keep hoping that it will end differently. I had the privilege to adjunct at a local university a year or 2 back and teach a 1 semester course on the Hebrew Bible. And midway through the semester, I realized the kids had no idea, grown-up students had no idea how the Bible ended, and they thought it was going to be a triumph. And it's not.
Yeah. Well, the rest of the Bible too is a tragedy in some ways also. So anyways,
yeah, but the story of the Jewish people is much longer than the Hebrew Bible. But I think we expect that it's going to, we just expect happy endings in a certain way. I also want to just take 1 minute and address really quickly some very understandable questions in the chat about what is going on in the Jewish calendar for the next 3 days. Okay, so if you're keeping track, today is the 7th day of Sukkot. It's called Hoshana Rabbah. We might expect it to be Chag because the 7th day of Pesach is Chag, but it's actually not, because otherwise we would have a 3-day Chag, which would just be, I think, really hard. I think that's the main reason it's not Chag. But tomorrow, which is also Shabbat, is called Shmini Atzeret. It's often translated as like the 8th day of assembly. Some people think of it as the 8th day of Sukkot. Some people think of it as its own holiday. MJL recently ran a whole program on what is Shmini Atzeret, what's it about, and my colleague Mara will probably be happy to put the link to that program in the chat if you would like to spend a whole hour exploring what Shmini Atzeret is. It comes in at sunset tonight along with Shabbat. And the Torah reading, therefore, tomorrow is specifically for Shmini Atzeret. It's not on the cycle, but it's key to Shmini Atzeret. And then finally, on Sunday, we get to Simchat Torah. It's no longer Sukkot. For those of us in diaspora, anyway, Simchat Torah is the celebration of finishing the Torah and starting over again. And that is when we read Vizot HaBracha, the last portion in the Torah, and then we flip right over to Breshit, to Genesis, and start over again. So I hope that answered some of the calendrical questions. To make it even more confusing, by the way, Simchat Torah and Shmini Atzeret are the same day in Israel. So I just explained it for diaspora, assuming most people in this call are on diaspora. But if you're in Israel, then Shabbat is going to do triple duty for you. I believe it's going to be Shabbat and Shmini Atzeret and Simchat Torah all rolled into one. Okay, that's the answers to the very confusing things going on in the Jewish calendar this weekend, but I don't want to take any more time from Dr. Schwartz. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. So I know my job here. I'm supposed to provide the historical, critical, crushing all everyone's assumptions, but no. But so I'll give just a very quick overview of some sort of classic historical approaches to what is going on in the book of Deuteronomy. And as is always the case with these sorts of things, this is an oversimplification. The particular theories I'm going to talk about are inevitably more complicated in terms of where sort of contemporary scholarship is at. But this would be sort of the classic intro level overview just of some of the basic dynamics that are going on. So the book of Deuteronomy, as part of the overall Torah, presents itself, as we've already heard, in one way or another, as Moses' kind of retelling and reinterpretation of both Israel's story, but also the content of Israel's covenant, right? The laws. As Dr. Scheinerman mentioned, the word Deuteronomy in Greek literally means second law, and the bulk of the book, the core, is a legal code, a legal collection that's kind of bookended by narrative recaps, and then as we get toward the end of the book, some actual narrative of what is starting to happen as they get closer and closer to Moses' death. So the prevailing critical view of this would be that Deuteronomy was written as an attempt to revise various elements of previously existing Israelite laws and traditions to suit the theological and political agendas of later writers, and that what we now encounter within the canonical shape of the Torah as Moses' interpretation was actually the interpretation of other people who might not necessarily have seen themselves as simply retelling or expanding upon, but actually in some cases trying to fix or replace certain things, right? So the laws that Moses goes over in Deuteronomy are presented as being given in the plains of Moab, right? That's spatially where they're located, but that is not where these laws are received. What Moses says is that God actually told me all this, and what we just saw from Deuteronomy chapter 5 up on the source sheet said a little bit about this. Moses says, God told me all of this stuff while I was up on the mountain, but I haven't told you. I didn't tell you back then when it actually happened. I'm waiting, and now that you're about to enter the promised land, this is where we're going to go over this content. But this is not new content. This is actually what the revelation was. And that seems to be a kind of narrative sleight of hand for the authors of Deuteronomy to say that their version of the Israelite laws is the actual thing that Moses received. And a critical approach, again, the kind of prevailing boilerplate, just very oversimplified version, would be that the laws in Deuteronomy are kind of a systematic, dedicated revision of, in particular, the laws that we find in the so-called covenant code in the book of Exodus, roughly chapters 21 to 23 of Exodus, right after the initial giving of the Ten Commandments. And you can see this because there's these really fascinating one-to-one correspondences where Deuteronomy does seem to be saying, okay, this law, but updated to reflect certain changes and certain disagreements about various theological and social political issues. And one of the most important ones that has been central for understanding the historical place of Deuteronomy is that Deuteronomy is very invested in the idea that there is only one legitimate place where Israel can worship God, right? It's actually not something that is obvious from the earlier material in the Torah, where there are plenty of indications that there were multiple sites of worship, multiple local altars. And Deuteronomy chapter 12 that's the beginning of the Deuteronomic code, makes very clear there is only one legitimate place. It doesn't name it. It says, because they're not there yet, they haven't conquered the land. So it says the place where God will choose to cause his name to dwell, right? That is the only place where you can offer legitimate worship. Now, in the 19th century, critical Bible scholars noticed that this sounds rather like a scene in the second book of Kings, 2 Kings chapter 22, chapters 22 and 23. It's really all one story, in which the king of Judah, Josiah, is said to be reigning over Judah, and they're doing a kind of renovation of the temple, and the temples often served as archives in the ancient Near East. And what happens is they're just as I'm sure many of you have experienced when you are doing work on your house or preparing for a move and you dig up something that's been lost for a long time and say, oh yeah, I totally forgot about that. They find what they call a scroll of the Torah deep within the temple, and they take it before Josiah and they read it, and we're not told exactly what happens, but the reaction is very bad, right? Everyone starts freaking out, and they say, oh no, we haven't been, the implication is we haven't been doing the stuff that is commanded in this scroll of the Torah, and God is gonna punish us for this. And they go to a female prophet named Huldah, and she confirms their worst fears, that actually God is going to bring calamity upon Judah for their failure to abide by the laws of this Torah. But then Josiah kind of doesn't give up, and he institutes this sweeping religious and political reform across all of Judah. And the centerpiece of this is destroying and outlawing any sites of worship outside of Jerusalem and centralizing worship in the temple in Jerusalem. And that focus on centralizing worship sounds so similar to what Deuteronomy commands at the beginning of the law code, and all kinds of other pieces of language in the story in Kings sound like Deuteronomy. The use of the word Torah there matches what Dr. Scheinerman was going over in terms of the profile of this word in the book of Deuteronomy. So critical scholars in the 19th century concluded that actually that scroll in the Josiah story was kind of an early form of Deuteronomy that was either written or updated from even earlier materials to justify this reform that Josiah or his associates wanted to institute. And a lot of the changes that the law code makes to earlier material reflects this interest in having only one legitimate cult site. Just one very clear example, both Exodus 21 from the Covenant Code and Deuteronomy have laws about how to free your slaves. And the law about this in Exodus, it's a little unclear, but it seems to suggest that part of the process, basically like, you're supposed to free your slaves every certain number of years, and but the slaves might say, "Oh, actually, we don't want to be freed," right? And we this is a good, like, we're comfortable here, we're taken care of. This is better than the alternative if we were out on our own. We want to stay in your house forever, right? And so then there's this whole ritual about how to mark that transition to being like a permanent slave, and in Exodus, it's a little unclear, but it seems like you're supposed to take them to a cultic space, I mean, to a space of worship, to a kind of shrine, to a religious space. And in Deuteronomy, they take away that requirement. You don't need to take them to a shrine. And the reason why seems to be is that Deuteronomy is assuming that there is only one legitimate place. There is only one legitimate shrine. There is only one legitimate sanctuary, one legitimate place where you can worship God. And therefore, if you live in the Galilee, right, in the far north of Israel, and you want to do this ceremony involving your slave, traveling to Jerusalem to do that is just, it's not practical, right? So whereas the earlier text assumed that every town has their local altar where you could do this, it's just a matter of walking up the street. In Deuteronomy, they have instituted this new conception of worship that requires changes to all sorts of laws. So that's just one example, but it does seem like Deuteronomy was actually fully updating the law in response to its new conception of worship and some other theological differences, which we don't have time to get into. But then what's interesting is that as it's integrated into the Torah as just Moses' final speech, and now is alongside the material that it was updating, it is kind of represented as Moses' kind of personal reinterpretation. And what I love about this is that it's a way of seeing how the critical reading of the Bible, of the Torah, as human beings interpreting of older material in light of their new circumstances, in a funny way, actually aligns with how the Torah is itself presenting it, right? That this is Moses's human interpretation of past teachings and past laws.
Thank you so much. All right, we are going to open it up to your questions now. I'm going to start with one that came earlier in the chat, but please, if you have other questions, thoughts, comments, things you'd like to talk about, feel free. It is true that more so than any other book, I think, in the Bible, this is, well, I don't know if that's true, but this is a very Moses-centric book, maybe even more than something like Shemot, like Exodus, right? And so one question we got was, in Exodus, we really heard that Moses is a stutterer, that he is not eloquent. And yet in this book, Moses is fluidly delivering long, beautiful speeches. How do we square those two? Did he learn to speak better? Did he get his stuttering coach?
I want to call out that that's a great question. Like, just the question in itself there is beautiful and like points to like how the Torah like engages us, and what the conversation is that follows. Like there's an astute reader out there who said, wait a minute, here's a story that was key to the early life of Moses, right? We heard this before. Moses doesn't like to get up in front of the people. And then look what happens at the end. How do we square these two? So much Torah, I want to say lowercase t, but it's all capital T. But so much Torah comes from questions about the Torah, and the Torah itself, as read as a unified document, invites this question. And sometimes you're so lulled into, right? You have the stories in Exodus where we learn about Moses' early personality as presented there. There's all of Vayikra, which is its own law code and all these things. And sometimes by the time we get to Dvarim at the end, we forget about this and we forget to ask that question. So like, kudos for asking that question. And I think the question there is more important than the answer, because there are all kinds of answers about it. So that's one response to that. And then, some of this is about, then you have to pick your path. Like, has Moses grown and explored new skills? And gained new skills that he didn't have at the beginning? Like, new Moses leader, had trouble with public speaking. Experienced Moses doesn't. Or is your path, the different parts of the Torah come from different sources and different communities. And so those traditions from Shemot aren't part of the vision of Deuteronomy. The agenda of Deuteronomy is not about Moses' character, but about the themes that Dr. Schwartz spoke about. And depending on which path through the Torah you take, or which path you take this year or next year, your answer might be different. But what's great is that question is always a question each time we go through the text. And I guess I want to give kudos to that.
Anything you want to add, Dr. Schwartz?
Well, just to say, it's another example of how something can originate in just like, these were two different texts, right? They had two different accounts, but then the way that it all gets put together, we can construct meaning out of that, and maybe even infer some meaning in terms of what the people who put this together were intending, right? The idea that Moses started, we just don't know what that phrase means when it says that he was heavy of mouth, right? It's not clear what that means even. Maybe we have some ancient Near Eastern parallels to help us understand it, but at the end of the day, is this referring to a physical speech impediment? Is it referring to a lack of confidence, right? It's hard to say, but if there is something that is really, I think, nice about this idea that Moses starts off, for whatever reason, very unconfident, being with lack of confidence in being a public speaker, being a public figure, and then really grows into that role over the course of the narrative. And one thing I will just point out, I don't think this has been mentioned yet, forgive me if it was, is that one of the places where Moses kind of pushes back on this attempt by God to commission him, saying, I can't do this. The phrase is lo ish divarim anochi, right? I am not a man of words, a man of divarim. And then, of course, the book of Deuteronomy, this huge speech that he's giving, as Dr. Scheinerman mentioned, is called in Hebrew divarim, right? It begins, Elah ha-divarim. These are the words that Moses spoke, right? And so there is a midrashic connection that the rabbis make where they note that Moses says, I am not a man of divarim. The irony that then his great speech, right, begins, the book describing it begins, Elah ha-divarim. These are the words.
I wonder, I was just thinking about the flip of that, as you said that. If Moses is heavy of speech, and we don't know exactly what that means, or heavy of mouth, I liked how you phrased that. Maybe that means like he drones. I just think Devarim is heavy. It's long speeches. It's hard to read through. Moses had enough trouble getting the Israelites to Pharaoh to pay attention in the stories at the beginning, and he had Aaron speaking for him. Maybe he needed Aaron to edit it down. Maybe this was his style all along. He thought if he came with these long talks at the beginning, it wouldn't sit well. And he needed a press secretary to deliver the message in a different manner. I mean, I don't think that's the original intention, but I wonder if you flip it and say, maybe this was his style all along. And he knew that, oh my God, if I give a 40-chapter talk and before we leave Egypt, it's over before it even started.
So let's talk a little bit more about Moses, because we have a bunch of questions because obviously this is Moses's book, and I mean, they're all Moses's books, but this is really Moses's books in some way. And also we alluded already to the disappointments at the end of this book, and people want to talk. They are very troubled by the fact that Moses, who perhaps deserved to enter the promised land more than everyone, did not get to. And what was the deal with the rock? And how was that so bad? And was that really the reason, and why? What do you guys make of that?
Go ahead, Dr. Schwartz. You go first this time.
Sorry, can you repeat the question? You cut out on my end for a second.
I'm sorry, I'm having a few internet issues here today. People want to talk about the disappointment at the very end of this book that Moses, who of all people deserves to enter the promised land, doesn't get to. Why didn't he get to go in?
Right. Yeah. So okay. Yeah. Important question. Of course. Regardless of what the kind of explicit reason is in terms of his past actions, I think that there is something that is very profound about the idea that the person who's been kind of responsible for leading the people into, to the land, almost by definition can't participate in that triumph. The book of Deuteronomy, Moses knows he's going to die, right? It's said at the beginning. This is not a surprise. The whole book is really beset by this awareness of mortality, and it's always struck me as very appropriate that we read it in such close succession with the book of Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, which is read as a Megillah on the Shabbat of Hol HaMoed of Sukkot, which this year also ends up being Shmini Atzeret, so that's part of why Shul is going to be so long tomorrow. Kohelet is a fascinating book whose whole theme is just awareness of mortality and the futility, that the hevel is the Hebrew word of this feeling that you've expended all this energy in your life, and then it's what does it all amount to when you die? You have no control over what comes after you, and that's Moses. That's what Moses is grappling with in Deuteronomy. And it's perhaps not surprising from a critical perspective. There are a lot of indications that the book of Deuteronomy is influenced by the so-called wisdom tradition, right? The kind of group, the genre of literature or the theme that a book like Kohelet is an example of. So I think that there's a kind of there's something, regardless of what is this a punishment or what the specific reason is, the different authors of the Torah might have their own views about that. But I think there's something kind of built into the structure of Deuteronomy and the deeper theme of it that this is, you can't ultimately partake in the fruits of your labor in some way, and that Moses is the kind of embodiment of that. And the question is, what do we do in the awareness of that? To use Kohelet's language, that hevel, that futility, and the fact that Moses says, "I'm still going to put effort toward this, even though I'm not going to live to see it," I think is very powerful.
I would also just add that it is not in the nature of this literature to have happy endings, right? And the stories that we hear, we talk a lot about how the characters in the Hebrew Bible are so human and so flawed, and what goes on with that too is that their lives are so incomplete and unsatisfying in certain ways, right? The two greatest kings of Israel, David and Solomon, started so promisingly, and both of their lives ended in descent into misdeed and tragedy, right? Abraham's life had lots of tragedy. Isaac's life ended with tragedy. It didn't go so great for Jacob. Joseph, it kind of ended on a triumphal note, but then the Israelites descended into slavery a few generations later. There's a lot it is in the mode of this literature to see these characters as deeply flawed, and also to reflect on the ways that their lives are not fulfilled. And in that vein, I just wanted to share one book that I've been thinking about recently. This is by Harold Kushner, who in the last few decades has been one of the most popular theologians for Jews in the world. And he wrote a short book, it's less known than some of his others, called Overcoming Life's Disappointments, because none of us has a life where everything we want is fulfilled for us, right? I think that's probably almost universally true. We know none of us gets everything, and all of us are going to have deep wishes and desires that aren't fulfilled. And he really looks to Moses as a biblical model for how to navigate that. So if you're looking for something that ties into this book and may have some meaning for your life, I can recommend that. I see we have 2 raised hands. So in the last 2 minutes remaining, I want to give those people a chance to chat. Ginger, I see you have your hand up, and then someone whose parents presciently named them iPhone also has a question. So we'll start with Ginger, and we'll see if we can get to your questions before we wrap up at the bottom of the hour.
I just have a bunch of things to say, as you can imagine. First thing, I agree with what you guys are saying. I have real strong issues about Moses not being allowed to go. And what it gets me concerned, if Moses does one thing about kicking a rock, can't go to promised land after dealing 40 years with people who probably just bitched and bitched and bitched, put up with it, kicks a rock after having lost his brother and sister, can't fulfill his lifelong dream. What does that say about what do I do? I mean, what's going to happen to me if I do something wrong? Am I going to be punished? I mean, it makes me a little bit, well, probably I should have probably been in hell by now, but you know, I mean, if that's all it takes to not fulfill life's dreams, it makes me a little bit nervous. He just wasn't given, was God just leading Moses on? It's like, when you do these 40 years, I'm gonna let you go. The last thing I want to say is, I understand that maybe Moses had passed his prime for being a leader, right? And it was okay that Joshua led them in, but why couldn't Moses go along as a prophet emeritus? You know, go along.
Ginger, I can't hear you. Is that just my internet?
I think she's muted.
Okay. What I was saying is, with Moses having so easily not been allowed to go to the promised land, again, makes me concerned if kicking a rock, I realize that disobeyed God was enough to not have him have such dire consequences. What does that mean for my own life? What does it take for me not to get my dreams fulfilled by doing one mistake? Heaven knows I should probably be in whatever place you're supposed to be by making one mistake. And he had just lost his brother and sister. For goodness sake, let the man friggin' grieve. He's already dealt with, people bitching for 40 friggin' years. He's probably going in circles for 40 years. That's my guess. And the other thing is,
yep. I think we've got it, Ginger. Thank you so much. Yes, it's so frustrating. And it's interesting too, because this is the same Moses that describes God, as we have heard over and over in the high holiday literature this month, as Adonai El Rachum V'Chanun, right? God is compassionate and forgiving. But but it's true. Moses doesn't fulfill his life dreams, and sadly, neither do a lot of us, and neither do a lot of other biblical characters. And the Bible views life as hard and often tragic. So, and I think we will continue to struggle with this. We are very short on time, so I'm going to go ahead and catch one more question from iPhone, and then we are going to need to wrap up. I'm sorry for not being able to address everything in this hour. It's such a rich book, and that is why we read it over and over and over again. So. This other hand we have.
Right. My sense is that we have the wrong focus on why he's not going into Israel. It's not that he was angry and struck the rock. Moses has been angry many times. God has been angry many times. But what his great violation is that he took credit for the water coming forth, which was God's work. And for taking on the role of God is a reason he wasn't able to go. Interestingly, this at the end of Deuteronomy sort of parallels in Genesis, where we have Eve saying, look, I'm like God, I too have made a man. So it's this role of presuming that you are God's equivalent that gets you either out of paradise or can't enter paradise.
That is definitely a classic interpretation, and I think a helpful one to many people. If you are left slightly unsatisfied, I think that is how you're supposed to be left a little bit. If we have only partially answered your questions, I think that's probably appropriate, because the whole idea here is that this is supposed to inspire discussion and keep us moving and thinking and questioning and continually turning the text to find new meaning. So it's been a real pleasure to explore the last chapter of the Torah with you and thinking about it in the context of the larger Torah. I hope some of this is meaningful for you as you head into synagogue this weekend, if that is where you are headed, to read the last chapters of the Torah and then immediately start back over, because we never finish, right? We always go straight from the end right back to the beginning. And I want to just thank again our panelists, Rabbi Goldberg, Dr. Schwartz, for bringing, as always, thoughtful and articulate insights, to all of you for bringing such interesting questions. And I wish you all a Chag Sameach, a Shabbat Shalom, as we enter this last part of the Tishrei holiday cycle. And yeah, thank you for learning with us. And we hope we will see you again very soon. Bye, everyone.